My brother inherited everything, and he never paid a single bill. I made sure the house he stole became the most expensive thing he ever owned. My parents lived in a 3-bedroom colonial in Bridgewater, New Jersey, the same house my brother Kevin and I grew up in. By the time I was 32, the roof needed replacing, the furnace was dying every other winter, and my father's diabetes had progressed to the point where his medication alone cost more than some people's rent. My mother had stopped driving after a minor stroke, so someone had to handle the groceries, the pharmacy runs, the appointments. That someone was me. I lived 20 minutes away. Kevin lived in Austin, and he called on Sundays. Sometimes. He had a way of making those calls feel like enough. He'd tell my mother about his girlfriend, about the barbecue place he'd found, about the weather, and she'd hang up glowing. I'd show up on Monday to unclog their bathroom drain and find a sticky note on the fridge that said Kevin might visit for Thanksgiving. He never did, but the note stayed up until Christmas. I set up automatic transfers to cover their property taxes in 2018. I never told Kevin. I never told anyone. It just felt like what a daughter does. My father had always been a quiet man, careful with money and careful with words. He kept a filing cabinet in the basement with every important document organized by year. He trusted systems. He trusted order. When Kevin started calling more frequently in early 2023, I thought it was a good sign. I thought maybe he was finally stepping up. He began flying in for weekend visits, something he hadn't done in years, and each time he'd take our father up for lunch or sit with him in the den watching old westerns. My mother told me it was beautiful, the two of them reconnecting. I remember feeling a flicker of something I pushed down. Not jealousy exactly, but the awareness that I had spent 6 years being useful while Kevin was being loved. My father died on a Tuesday in October. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed late, moved fast. He was gone within 11 weeks of his diagnosis. I handled the hospice arrangements. I handled the funeral home. I handled the flowers, the obituary, the pastor, the reception food. Kevin flew in the night before the service and gave a eulogy that made everyone cry. I sat in the front pew with my hands folded and my chest full of something I couldn't name. The will was read 10 days later. The attorney, a man I'd never met before named Gerald Linden, sat across from us in a beige conference room and read the document aloud. The house, the savings account, the small brokerage portfolio, and my father's life insurance policy were all left to Kevin James Whitfield, sole beneficiary. I was not mentioned, not as a secondary, not as a partial, not even by name. My mother had a small trust for living expenses, but everything of material value went to my brother. I looked at Kevin. He didn't look surprised. He looked prepared. His face held the exact expression of someone who had already rehearsed how to appear humble about something he'd been expecting. My ears started ringing. I asked Gerald when the will had been updated. He checked. February 14th, 2023, 8 months before my father died. 8 months during which Kevin had suddenly become the attentive, present son. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table with 6 years of bank statements spread out in front of me. I added it all up: property taxes, medical copays, prescriptions, the new furnace, the roof, the plumber, the electrician, the grocery deliveries, the mobility aids. Over 6 years, I had spent just under $94,000 keeping my parents' lives functional. I had never asked for reimbursement. I had never asked for recognition. And now the man who had contributed nothing was inheriting everything, including the house I had kept standing. I called my mother the next morning. I asked her very carefully whether she knew about the will. She said my father had talked to Kevin about legacy. She said Kevin had explained that as the son, as the one who would carry the family name, it made sense. She said Kevin had told my father that I was doing fine financially, that I didn't need help, that I had always been independent. She said it like it was a compliment. I pulled the county records. The will had been drafted by an attorney Kevin had found, not the family lawyer my parents had used for decades. I called the original attorney, David Chen, who told me my father's previous will had split everything evenly. He said he'd been surprised when my father stopped returning his calls in early 2023. The timeline was clean. Kevin had flown in, built rapport, introduced a new attorney, and guided my father into a new will during a period when his health was already declining. My father wasn't incompetent, but he was vulnerable, tired, and deeply susceptible to the son who had finally come home. Kevin hadn't forged anything. He hadn't broken any law I could prove. He had simply been more strategic than me. For 3 days, I did nothing. I didn't call Kevin. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call a lawyer. I sat with it. I let the full shape of what had happened settle into my bones. And somewhere around the third night, sitting in the dark with a cold cup of coffee, I stopped being sad. I opened my laptop and started building a spreadsheet. The first thing I did was organize every financial record I had. Every transfer, every receipt, every canceled check, every credit card statement showing a charge at the Bridgewater Pharmacy, or the roofing company, or the medical supply store. I documented 6 years of expenditures with dates, amounts, and descriptions. Then I contacted a forensic accountant I'd found through a colleague and had her prepare a formal financial summary. $93,812. It looked different as a number on a professional letterhead than it had as a running total in my head. Next, I retained an estate litigation attorney named Sandra Polk. Sandra told me that while contesting the will on grounds of undue influence would be difficult to prove in court, there was another avenue. New Jersey law recognizes claims for unjust enrichment. If I could demonstrate that my financial contributions had materially preserved and enhanced the value of the estate, I had a legitimate claim against the estate itself. Not against the will, but against the assets the will distributed. The distinction mattered. I wasn't saying the will was invalid. I was saying the estate owed me money before it could distribute anything to Kevin. Sandra filed the claim in probate court 3 weeks after the will was read. Kevin called me the day he was served. His voice had a quality I'd never heard before, thin and defensive and trying to sound casual. He said I was being emotional. He said Dad wanted this. He said I was going to tear the family apart. I told him I had receipts for every dollar I'd spent and that my attorney would be in touch. Then I hung up. The financial claim was the first layer. There was a second one he never saw coming. The second thing I did was quieter. I reached out to David Chen, my parents' original attorney, and asked him to provide a sworn statement confirming the prior will, confirming that my father had stopped contact abruptly, and confirming that the new attorney, Gerald Linden, had no prior relationship with my family. I also obtained my father's medical records from the relevant period, which showed increasing cognitive fatigue and a new anxiety medication prescribed right around the time the will was changed. None of this proved coercion. All of it painted a picture. Sandra filed a supplemental motion requesting that the court examine whether the will change met the standard for undue influence, not as our primary claim, but as context for why the estate owed restitution. The judge agreed to hear both matters together. Kevin hired his own attorney. He tried to accelerate the probate process to get the house transferred into his name before the litigation concluded. Sandra blocked it with a temporary restraining order on asset distribution. The house sat frozen. Kevin couldn't sell it, he couldn't rent it, he couldn't refinance it, but he was now legally responsible for its upkeep because the estate named him as sole heir and the court considered him the de facto owner for purposes of maintenance. The property taxes came due in January. The furnace died again in February. The roof I'd paid to replace 5 years ago started leaking in a new spot. Kevin, who had never paid a single bill on that house, was now hemorrhaging money to maintain a property he couldn't touch. The hearing was in April. Sandra presented the full financial record, the forensic accounting summary, the testimony from David Chen, the medical records, and a timeline that made the pattern of Kevin's behavior impossible to ignore. Kevin's attorney argued that my contributions had been voluntary gifts, not loans, and that my father had the right to distribute his estate however he chose. The judge agreed with the second point. My father did have that right. But the judge also ruled that the estate had been unjustly enriched by my sustained financial contributions, and that a restitution claim of $78,000 was supported by the evidence. The remaining $15,000 was deemed too ambiguous to categorize. $78,000, ordered paid from the estate before distribution. The savings account held about $60,000. The brokerage portfolio held another $30,000. After the restitution payment, legal fees, and court costs, the estate Kevin inherited was barely enough to cover what he'd already spent maintaining the house during the freeze. I watched him do the math in the hallway outside the courtroom. His attorney was talking, but Kevin wasn't listening. He was staring at the wall with the expression of someone who had just realized that the thing he'd taken was now taking from him. The house was his, technically. A 3-bedroom colonial in Bridgewater with aging plumbing, a temperamental furnace, and a tax bill that arrived every quarter like clockwork. He lived in Austin. He didn't want to live in New Jersey. He wanted the sale price, clean and easy. But the market had softened, the house needed work, and he was now the sole person responsible for a property that had quietly consumed my money for 6 years and was ready to start consuming his. He put it on the market in June. It sold for less than he hoped. After the realtor's commission and the capital gains implications and the remaining estate fees, Kevin netted a little over $40,000 from the entire inheritance. For context, he had spent roughly $22,000 in legal fees and property maintenance during the litigation. His profit for the whole operation was maybe $18,000. My mother and I don't talk about the case. We talk about the weather, about her garden, about whether she needs anything from the store. There's a distance now that wasn't there before. Something neither of us will name. She knows what Kevin did. I think she knew before I did. But he was her son who came home, and I was her daughter who filed a lawsuit. And in her accounting of the world, one of those things is forgivable and the other isn't. I don't regret it. But I think about my father sometimes sitting in that den with Kevin, watching old westerns, believing his son had finally come back for him and not for the filing cabinet in the basement. I think about how easy it is to love the person who shows up with warmth instead of the person who shows up with a wrench. I kept every receipt, every single one. Not because I thought I'd need them, but because that's who I am. Turns out, that's also what saved me.